Good morning, Literature Group. This is Mr. T, ready for another chapter. It's going to be chapter 5 of The Incredible Journey. And I thought I'd give you as a backdrop our wild animal here in the classroom, Billy Bob Joe. I just fed him. He was really happy to have his mouse, and everything's as it would be here in the classroom, except we're really missing you guys badly. So let's continue with our incredible journey. I happen to actually have the book here. Before, I was having to read it off my computer in New Orleans, and then before I had the book. So this is the book we're reading in hard copy. Love to read books in paper. And I thought I'd show you a picture because there's some really cool illustrations in it. One of the illustrations from chapter 4, and it'll remind you as to what happened, where our friends came upon a campment of Native Americans, and they welcomed them, they fed them, but then they left. So let's see what happens in chapter 5 as the incredible journey, incredible adventure continues. Oops, Mr. T's got to find the page for chapter 5 here. Not used to, here it is. I'm not going to show you the picture till the end because it tells you what the chapter is about. The trio journeyed on, the pattern of the next few days being very much the same, free of incident or excitement. Leaving their resting place at daylight, they would jog steadily along by day, their pace determined mainly by the endurance of the old dog. Their favorite sleeping places were hollows under uprooted trees, where they were sheltered from the wind and able to burrow down among the drifted leaves for warmth. At first there were frequent halts and rests, but daily the terrier became stronger, and after a week he was lean, but the scars on his shoulders were healing, and his coat was smooth and healthy. In fact, he was in better condition and looked younger and fitter than at the outset of the journey, because he had been living the happy life of a dog inside and fed all the time with dog food. So now he's lean and tough and strong and courageous. He had always had a happy disposition and most of the time looked perfectly content, trotting along through the vast stillness of the bush with stolid, unalterable good humor. By the way, those are adjectives: stolid, unalterable, good humor. Cool functions of words. Sheila Burnford, our author, is fantastic in her descriptive writing. So you watch for her use of these kinds of adjectives to make you see in your mind's eye. You can kind of close your eyes while Mr. T's reading, and you can see what the story looks like in the setting it's in. He was almost always hungry, but that skillful hunter, the cat, kept him provided with food which, while scarcely ever satisfying, was adequate by his new standard of living. It was only the famished young dog who really suffered, for he was not a natural hunter and wasted a lot of ill-afforded energy in pursuit. He lived mainly on frogs, mice, and occasional leavings of the other two. Sometimes he was lucky enough to frighten some small animal away from its prey, but it was a very inadequate diet for such a large and heavily built dog, and his ribs were beginning to show through his shining coat. He was unable to relax, his constant hunger driving him to forage even when the other two were resting, and he never joined them in their amiable foolery, when sometimes the cat would skitter away in a pretended fear from the growling, wagging white dog, often ending in being chased up a tree. Then the Labrador would sit apart, aloof and watchful, nervous and tense. It seemed as though he was never able to forget his ultimate purpose and goal. He was going home to his own master, home where he belonged and nothing else mattered. This lodestone of longing, this certainty, drew him to lead his companions ever westward through the wild and unknown country as unerringly as a carrier pigeon released from its alien loft. Carrier pigeons are pigeons that were trained to deliver messages and then returned to their sender. and it looks like the Labrador thinks he knows where he's going. Nomadic life seemed to agree with the cat. He was in fine fettle, sleek and well groomed, as debonair as ever, and had adapted himself well, so well that at times it appears as though he were positively enjoying the whole expedition. Sometimes he left the other two for an hour or so at a time, but they had ceased to pay any attention to his absence now, and sooner or later he always reappeared. They traveled mostly on old abandoned trails, astonishingly plentiful in this virtually uninhabited region. Wow, listen to those adjectives. Astonishingly plentiful in this virtually uninhabited region. Wow, they're in the wilderness of Canada. It was fortunate that the Indian summer weather still continued, for the short, thin coat of the bull terrier could not withstand low temperatures. And although a thicker undercoat was already growing in to compensate, it would never be adequate. The cat's coat, too, was thickening, making him appear heavier, and the Labrador needed no reinforcement and was already adapted to all the extremes. The flat, thick hairs so close together that they made it almost waterproof surface. The short days were warm and pleasant when the sun was high, but the nights were cold. One night, when there was a sudden sharp frost, the old dogs shivered so much that they left the shallow cave of their resting place soon after the bright ring moon rose and traveled through the remainder of the night, resting mostly the following morning in the warmth of the sun. The leaves were losing their color rapidly, and many of the trees were nearly bare, but the dogwood and the pigeonberry by the sides of the trail still blazed with color, and the Michaelmas daisies and fireweeds flourished. Many of the birds of the forest had already migrated south. Those that were left gathered into great flocks, flying into the air with their restless chatter as they milled about, the long drawn-out streamers suddenly wheeling in the form of clamorous clouds, lifting and falling in indecision, flocks of these migratory birds. They saw few other animals. The noisy progress of the dogs warned the shy natural inhabitants long before their approach, and those that they did meet were too busy or concerned with their own wintry preparations to show much curiosity. The only other bear that they had encountered was sleek and fat as butter, complacent and sleepy, his thoughts obviously already running on hibernation, and quite uninterested in these strange animals. He was, in fact, sitting on a log in the sun when the animals saw him, and after giving them a sleepy inspection from his little deep-set eyes, he yawned and continued the lazy scratching of his ear. The cat, however, growled angrily to himself for nearly an hour after this encounter. You think the cat was remembering what happened before? Sure enough. The rabbits and weasels had changed to their winter white coats. A few snow buntings had appeared, and several times they heard the wild, free, exultant calling of the wild geese, and had looked up to see their long, black V-necked skeins passing overhead in the long journey southwards, like to Leesburg. Because we have Canadian geese all over all the ponds and lakes and rivers here in Northern Virginia. They come down here and they winter down here now because there's plenty of food and lots of water. And it's warmer than it's been. Virginia winters have gotten warm over the years, so we now see more Canadians down here. The visitors to the Northland were leaving, and those who remained were preparing themselves for the long winter that lay ahead. Soon the whole tempo, the very pulse of the North, would beat slower and slower until the snow fell like a soft coverlet, then snug and warm beneath, in dens and burrows and hollows, the hibernating animals would sleep, scarcely breathing in their deep unconsciousness until spring. Oh my goodness. I got to read that sentence again. Listen to this. Wow, what creative writing. Soon the whole tempo, the very pulse of the North, would beat slower and slower until the snow fell like a soft coverlet, then, snug and warm beneath it in dens and burrows and hollows, the hibernating animals would sleep, scarcely breathing in their deep unconsciousness, until spring. Man, I wish I could write sentences like that. Wow. As though aware of these preparations and their meaning, the three adventurers increased their pace as much as possible within the limits determined by the old dog's strength. On good days, they covered as much as 15 miles. What's the farthest you've ever walked? Mr. T, I've walked 15 miles. I remember touring St. Petersburg, Russia, with Mr. Terrio and his sister, our daughter Damre, and that was a long day, 15 miles. Wow. Since they had left the Indian encampment on the shores of the Rice Lake, they had not seen any other human beings or any sign of human habitation, save once at nightfall when they were nosing around a garbage can outside a darkened cookhouse of a lumber camp deep in the very heart of the bush. One of the main industries in Canada is logging, where they cut trees and turn them into wood to build houses and whatever. And so these logging camps are isolated out in the forest where the cutting of the wood takes place. Marauding bears had been there recently. Their rank, heavy smell still hung in the air, and the cat refused to even come nearer. But the old dog, watched by the other, tipped over the heavy can and then tried to pry off the lid with a practiced nose. The can rattled and banged loudly on some rocks, and neither dog heard the door opening in the dark building behind. See, that's one of those cool sentences that the author uses to let you know something significant is going to happen. I'll read it again. The can rattled and banged loudly on some rocks, and neither dog heard the door opening in the dark building behind. Suddenly, a blast of shot ripped through the bottom of the can, blowing the lid off and strewing the contents all over the old dog. Deafened and stunned, he stood for a moment, shaking his head. A second shot clanged against the metal and brought him to his senses. He grabbed the bone in passing from the plenty strewn all about and dashed after the Labrador, running so fast that he outdistanced him. A spray of pellets followed, stinging into their hindquarters so that they leaped simultaneously and doubled their speed. Soon they were in the shelter of the bush, but it was a long time before they halted for that night. The old dog was so exhausted that he slept until dawn. The pellets had been only momentarily painful, but the incident increased the young dog's wary nervousness. So one of the old lumberjacks, I guess, thought they were just stray dogs rummaging in a trash can, so he shot at them with a shotgun. However, a few days later, despite his care, he had an unexpected encounter. They were drinking at midday from a shallow ford, crossing an overgrown track into a worn-out silver mine, when a cottontail started up in the bracken across the water. The young dog sprang after, drenching the other two, and they watched the chase. The rabbit heads up, the dog down, linked in a swerving, leaping rhythm of almost ballet-like precision until it disappeared among the trees. The terrier shook his coat, spraying the cat again furiously, and the cat stalked off. Alone now, with a brief moment of freedom from the constant daytime urging, the old dog made the most of it. He pottered happily along around the lichen rocks and mossy banks. Lichen and moss, we know how that grows in our woods here at school. Savoring everything with his delicate connoisseur's nose. He flicked the caps of several large fawn mushrooms in some displeasure. A shiny black beetle received his keen attention for a while, and he followed it like a bloodhound. Presently, he lost interest and sat on it. He yawned, scratched his ear, then rolled lazily on a patch of dried mud. Suddenly he lay quite still, his paws dangling limply, his head turned round on the ground towards the trail. He freed a crumpled ear to listen more intently. Then his tail registered his pleased anticipation. Someone was walking through the bush towards him. He scrambled to his feet and peered short-sightedly down the trail, his tail curving his hindquarters from side to side in welcome. When an old man carrying a canvas bag appeared, talking quietly to himself, the bull terrier stepped out and awaited him. The old man did not pause. Small and bent, he hobbled quickly past, lifting an ancient green felt hat from the crown of a white hair as he went, and nodding to the dog with a brief smile of great sweetness. Great sentence. I'll read it again. The old man did not pause. Small and bent, he hobbled quickly past, lifted an ancient green felt hat from the crown of his white hair as he went, and nodded to the dog with a brief smile of great sweetness. Great sentence. Two little gray-white chickadees preceded him, flitting from branch to branch over his head. The old dog fell in contentedly behind. Soon the cat appeared in the distance, running to catch up, his eyes on the chickadees, and far behind the cat again, his mouth framed around the dangling carcass of a rabbit, came the triumphant but deeply suspicious Labrador. The straggling procession continued along the cool green tunnel of the trail for half a mile, until the trees thinned out and they came upon a small cabin set back in a clearing within sight of the derelict mine workings. They passed one after another through a small, neatly raked garden between brown raspberry canes and leafless apple trees, and walked slowly up the few steps to the porch. This is promising, a human. Here the old man set his bag down, knocked on the green door, paused and opened it, standing courteously aside to motion his following in before him. The old dog walked in, the cat closely by his shoulder, then the man. The young dog hesitated by the trail side, his eyes round and distrustful above his burden. Then, apparently reassured by the open door, he carefully laid the rabbit down behind a bush, scratching at layers of leaves over it, and this done, followed the others. They stood in an expectant ring in the middle of the cavern, savoring a delicious and meaty smell. They watched the old man brush the brim of his hat, hang it on a peg, then hobble over to a small gleaming wood stove and thrust in another log, washing his hands afterwards in a basin filled from a dipper of water. Wow. I got to read that sentence again. You see, the author, she could have stopped that sentence in various places and put a period, but she didn't. She used commas, she used conjunctions to make it a complex and ever more interesting sentence. They watched the old man brush the brim of his hat, comma, hang it on a peg, comma, then hobble over to a small, comma, gleaming wood stove and, conjunction, thrust in another log, comma, washing his hands afterwards in a basin filled from a dipper of water. Wow. See how you can put sentences together, save words with punctuation, and make the sentences more complex and interesting? Think about that when you're writing in a writer's workshop. He took down 4 gold-rimmed plates from a dresser. A chipmunk appeared from behind a blue jug on the top shelf. Chattering excitedly, he ran over the man's arm to his shoulder, where he sat and scolded the strangers with bright, jealous eyes, his little striped body twitching with fury. 2 gleaming lamps appeared in the darkness of the cat's face, and his eyes swished in response, and his tail swished in response. But he restrained himself in deference to his surroundings. Normally, what would the cat do with a chipmunk? You know. The old man chided the chipmunk lovingly. Obviously, he's a pet, and he's become a companion for the old man living alone in the forest. The old man chided the chipmunk lovingly as he set 4 plates at the table, handing it a crust which bulged its cheeks, then ladling 4 very small portions of stew onto the plates. The little animal's noise fell away to an occasional disgruntled squeak, but he ran from shoulder to shoulder to keep his watch on the cat. The old dog edged nearer, looking very small behind a high-backed chair. The old man stood for a moment with his clear, childlike blue eyes closed and his lips moving, and drew out his chair and sat down. He looked around the table, suddenly irresolute, then his brow cleared, and he rose to draw up the 2 remaining chairs and a bench. "Do sit down," he said, and at the familiar command, the 3 animals behind him sat obediently. He ate slowly and fastidiously. Oh, wow, there's a word. That's an adjective. An adverb, because it says how he ate. He ate slowly, and he ate fastidiously. Fastidiously means really kind of picky. He was very, very careful with his eating. 2 pairs of hypnotized eyes followed every movement of the fork to his mouth. The 3rd pair remained fixed on the chipmunk. Presently the plate was empty, and the old man smiled around the table, but his smile turned again to bewilderment as he saw the 3 untouched plates. He considered them long and thoughtfully, then shrugged his shoulders and moved on to the next place. Soon that too came to a confusing end, and sighing, he moved on again. Spellbound, his visitors remained rooted on the floor. Even the old dog, for once, was nonplussed. Nonplussed means unaffected. Although he shivered in anticipation, saliva ran from his mouth at the enticing smell, he remained sitting as custom and training decreed. The old man sat on when the last plate was emptied, lost in his own world, his peaceful stillness diffusing through the little cabin, so that the watchers sat graven in their places. Graven means disappointed. A little wind stirred outside, swinging the door wide open on creaking hinges. A goosebeck flew in to perch on top, the mellow fall sunshine slanting on his brilliant plumage. And it seemed as though the living silence of the great forest around surged up and in through the open door with the birds coming, so that the animals stirred uneasily, glancing behind them. The chipmunk's shrill voice cut through the silence, and its claws scrabbled up the dresser as the cat half sprang, but recollected himself in time and slipped out the door after the goosebeck instead. In a sudden awakening, the old man had started to his feet. He looked around as though wondering where he was, his eyes lighting in surprise on the 2 dogs by the door. Slow recognition dawned on his face, and he smiled down affectionately through his gaze, looked through and beyond them. You must come more often, he said, and to the old dog, who stood wagging his tail at the gentle warmth in his voice, remember me most kindly to your dear mother. So this old fellow has been living alone for a long, long time, and he's began to imagine things around him. That can sometimes happen to very old people. And he thinks that the 3 animals that walked in the door that he met in the forest are people. And he thinks they're children, and he asks that they remember him most kindly to your dear mother. He escorted the dogs to the door. They filed past him, their tails low and still, then walked slowly and with great dignity down the little winding path between the raspberry canes and the apple trees to the overgrown tract. Here they waited for a moment while the young dog furtively uncovered his prize, and the cat joined them. Then, without looking back, they trotted close formation out of sight between the trees. So that's sad in a way. The old man could have, had he been sharper with his memory and his brain, if he had been sharper, he might have understood that these were stray dogs and a cat that were lost, and he might have helped rescue them. But he didn't, because he was an old hermit living alone and just didn't understand the situation. A quarter of a mile further on, the young dog looked carefully around before dropping his rabbit. He nudged it with his nose several times, then turned it over. A moment later, a red-stained fur lay scattered, and both dogs were eating ravenously, growling amicably as they crunched on the rabbit. The cat sat, flexing his claws as he watched. After a while, he rose on his hind legs and stretched his forepaws to their full extent against the tree, then methodically sharpening their claws on the bark. His head turned sharply, and he paused, still standing, at a rustle in the long dead grass. A split second later, he pounced in a bounding arch. A paw flashed out, pinned down and held. His head bent down, the small squeaking broke off abruptly. Before the dogs were even aware that he had gone, he was back again by his tree, cleaning his whiskers with soft, rounded paws. Was a skilled hunter. The following day, the travelers came down from the hills to find themselves on the banks of a river running north and south. It was almost 100 feet across to the far bank, and although shallow enough in an ordinary way, was far too deep for the animals to cross without swimming. Now think about this. They've been trending in their direction because of the instinct of the Labrador west. And now they've hit a wide river that runs north-south, which blocks their path, which the Labrador's instinct is telling him has to be due west. Think that's going to be a problem? We'll see. The young dog led the way downstream for some distance, looking for a means of crossing, and it was obvious that his companions would not even wet their feet if they could possibly help it, both sharing a great dislike for water. Now, it happens that Labradors are natural swimmers because they're retriever dogs, and when they're retrieving ducks that have been shot by hunters, as they've been trained to do for a long, long time, they're fantastic swimmers. But the other guys, not so much. Once or twice he plunged in and swam around, looking back at the other two, obviously trying to entice them by showing them how easy it was. But they remained sitting close together on the bank, united in misery, and he was forced to continue trotting downstream, becoming increasingly worried as he went, aware that it was the wrong direction. That was all one sentence. Amazing. It was lonely, uninhabited country, so that there were no bridges, and the river, if anything, became wider as they trotted along its banks. After 3 or 4 miles, the young dog could endure the frustration no longer. He plunged into the water and swam rapidly and strongly across to the far side, his tail streaming out behind like an otter's. He loved the water and was as much at home in it as the other two hated and feared it. He stood on the far bank, barking encouragingly, but the old dog whined in such distress, and the cat yowling in chorus, that he swam across again, paddling around the shadows near the bank. Once more, the Labrador swam the river, climbed out on the far side, shook himself, and barked. There was no mistaking the command. The old dog took another reluctant step forward, whining piteously, his expressive tail tucked under. The barking continued. Again the terrier advanced. Again the Labrador swam across to encourage him. 3 times he swam across, and the 3rd time the old dog waded in up to his chest and started swimming. He was not a very good swimmer. He swam in jerky, rapid moments, his head held high out of the water, his little black eyes rolling fearfully, but he was a bull terrier, a white cavalier, and he kept on, following the wake of the other, until at last he climbed out on the far side. So 2 of them are across. His transports of joy on reaching dry land were like those of a shipwrecked mariner after 6 weeks at sea in a raft. He rushed in circles, he rolled on his back, he ran around with alternate shoulders low in the long grass to dry himself, until finally he joined the Labrador on the bank to bark encouragingly at the cat. Now it happens that cats can swim, but the poor cat now showed the first signs of fear since leaving his journey. He was alone, and the only way to rejoin his friends lay in swimming across a terrible stretch of water. He ran up and down the bank, all the time keeping up his unearthly Siamese wailing. Siamese cats have a very distinct meow, especially when they're upset. The young dog went through the same tiring performance as he had used before, swimming to and fro, trying to entice him into the water, but the cat was beside himself with terror, and it was a long time before he finally made up his mind. When he did, it was with a sudden, blind-like, desperate rush to water, completely uncat-like. His expression of horror and distaste was almost comical as he started swimming towards the young dog who waited for him a few yards out. He proved to be a surprisingly good swimmer and was making steady progress across the dog swimming alongside, when tragedy struck. Oh no. Many years before, a colony of beavers had dammed a small creek which had tumbled into the river about 2 miles upstream. Since the beavers had left, the dam had been crumbling and loosening gradually, until it had become just a question of time before it would give away altogether and drain the flooded land behind. So, when beavers build a dam, it creates a blockade in the river, and water builds up behind it like a small lake. And if that beaver dam breaks, then that water has tremendous mass and weight, and gravity pulls it down the river, and it can be a flood. Now, by a twist of fate, a bad twist of fate, a rotten log gave way and a large section bulged forward under the added strain. Almost as the two animals reached midstream, the dam broke altogether. The pent-up force of the unleashed creek leapt through the gap in an ever-widening torrent, carrying everything before it and surging into the river, where it became a swift, mountainous wave, carrying small trees, torn branches, pieces of river and beaver dam before it on its crest. The young dog saw the outrushing wave several moments before it reached them and frantically tried to swim to a position upstream of the cat, instinctively trying to protect him, but it was too late. The great curling crested wave struggled over, submerging them in a whirling chaos of debris. The end of a log struck the cat full in the head. He went under and over until his body finally caught up in a half-submerged piece of the old dam and was carried along on the impetus of the wave as it tore down the riverbed. The old dog, barking wildly in anxiety, for he had sensed danger, although he could not see it, waded chest-deep into the churning water, but its force knocked him back again. Breathless and choking, he was forced to retreat. The old dog, strong swimmer though he was, made his way to the bank only with the greatest difficulty. Even then, he was carried almost half a mile downstream before his feet were on firm ground. Immediately set off down the river in pursuit. Several times he saw the little figure of the cat, half underwater, surging ahead on the swift white crest, but he was never near enough except at one point where the partially submerged piece of beaver dam caught onto an overhanging branch. He plunged in immediately, but just as he was nearly within reach, it tore free and once more went whirling down the river until it was lost to sight. Gradually, the old dog fell farther and farther behind. At last, he was brought to complete halt when the river entered a rocky gorge with no foothold on either side. He was forced to climb inland, and by the time he rejoined the river bank on the far side of the gorge, there was no sign of the cat. It was nearly dark when he returned to find the terrier, who was walking wearily towards him along the riverbank. The Labrador was exhausted, limping and utterly spent and miserable, so much so that he barely returned the greeting of the bewildered and lonely old dog, but dropped to the ground, his flanks heaving, and lay there until thirst drove him to the water's edge. They spent the night where they were, by the bank of the river, peaceful at last after the violence of the afternoon. They lay curled closely together for comfort and warmth, and when a thin, cold rain fell as the wind rose, they moved under the spreading branches of an old spruce for shelter. In the middle of the night, the old dog sat up, trembling all over with cold. He threw his head back and howled his requiem of grief and loneliness to the heavy, weeping sky, until at last the young dog rose wearily and led him away from the river, long before dawn broke, and over the hills to the west. It's an adventure story, and adventure stories often have bad things happen. Hopefully, things will work out in the end, but we don't know that at this point, do we? Our incredible journey will continue next week with Chapter 6. Mr. T, over and out.